Today I'm going to discuss the thought processes of a rare book dealer. And by that I mean, when I have a book to examine or catalog or investigate, how do I go about thinking about it from a new or novel perspective, a different light, so that I'm not merely rehashing everything that's been commonly said or written about the book, or even worse, looking at old booksellers' catalog descriptions or auction catalog descriptions and cutting and pasting and paraphrasing. Because by looking at a book from a new light, which takes effort, this is how we make discoveries. This is the value-added part of the rare book dealer equation, how we can justify our prices and how we can find new clients for a book and expand the market, because what may appeal to one client from a certain perspective may appeal to somebody completely different and unexpectedly when the book is presented in a fresh light. The other thing, I guess, is a personal connection that you can get with the book. And by that I mean that it's sort of like two friends who want to overcome their fear of heights and decide they want to go, let's say, rock climbing together. It's a sort of bonding experience. So by considering the book carefully and investigating it, you sort of bond with the book. And that is, of course, the joy and fun of both being a collector, if you're a collector, or being a rare book dealer. The book that I decided to discuss today is an exceptional one. It is the first edition printed in 1611 of the King James Bible, what we call the He version of the Bible, so the true first edition. The reason I chose it, it is hard to imagine a book that has been written about or everything is known about than one of the most famous books in the English language, and that it poses a particular challenge to a rare book cataloger to come up with a new perspective on it. I would also like to say that I would like you to consider this specific case of an exceptional book in the general sense, however, because even when I have a more modest volume in my hands, I still go about thinking about it in the same way. What can I say about this volume that is new and exciting? I'm not going to go very deeply into the history of the King James Bible. That's well known. You can easily Wikipedia it. I will just set the stage perhaps and say that when King James ascended the throne, there was a great need in England for a new version of the Bible, largely to bridge the gap between the bishop's version, which most people would read or hear at a church, and the Geneva version, which most people had for private contemplation, devotion in their house. So in 1604, a Puritan scholar at the famous Hampton Court Conference suggested to the king that a new translation was needed. The king agreed, and over 7 years and the efforts of 47 scholars, I think it was, in the most collaborative effort in the history of English printing and translation, the King James Bible was born. So now, how do I consider this book from a fresh perspective when everything has been written about it already? Well, the first thing I do want to think about in a book is its topography. I do that pretty much for any book. Is there something unusual about a book's topography? When people talk about the topography of the King James Bible, it's often held up in the highest esteem as one of the finest books printed in the 17th century, worthy of this translation of the Holy Scripture. I don't take that perspective. I find it to be a little bit of a hodgepodge printing, actually, at least for a book of this importance. The reason I say that is it doesn't really rise in terms of its elegance to, let's say, Gutenberg's printing of the Bible, or even the efforts, no efforts spared, that you would see in the scribes of Renaissance Florence or the illuminators. The Bible is printed in several fonts, the Gothic or black letter font, as well as Roman and Roman italic, each suited to its particular purpose. Gothic was used for the biblical text largely to provide some continuity between the bishop's version that people were already familiar with and this new version which they had hoped would be readily accepted. But the aspect of the topography that I want to focus on are actually the woodcut initial letters in the book, which I found absolutely fascinating. These initials come in various forms, whether they're floriated, whether they're biblical, or whether they're classically themed. Woodcut initials, let's say, of Neptune, or the laurel wreaths growing out of Diana's hands. And interestingly enough, the classically themed initials greatly outnumber the biblical ones, which is very strange because they are, in essence, pagan or polytheistic and have absolutely nothing to do with the biblical text that they are set against. Now, when you think about the juxtaposition of text and image, you would hope that there would be some consideration to the creation of a harmonious artistic whole. If you take one of the most famous books in the history of printing, the 1499 Hippopotamachia Polyphili of Aldus Manutius, that is often held up as one of these superb examples of the combination of text and image. And you did have the limitations of some 17th century English printers, which were often did not meet the artistic excellence of some of their European counterparts. But you did have printers even in England a little bit later on, like William Leybourne, the English mathematical printer, who really took care and effort to make sure that his woodcut initials matched the text beautifully. So, why did Barker choose to use these rather haphazardly placed or chosen woodcut initials to illustrate a biblical text? Well, he could have been appealing to his audience that came from a classical tradition and would have understood the motifs and appreciated them. I think once when I did a year abroad at Oxford, I had to write a 17th century paper on English coinage, and I presented it to my professor, who seized upon a line where I discussed the English poet Andrew Marvell. And he said, "That line is so eloquent and wonderful." I said, "Why?" It was just a simple line where I mentioned Andrew Marvell. He said, "Precisely because you mentioned Marvell, I know who he is, a minor poet, and you are speaking to the right audience and flattering me." So sometimes things are done with the audience in mind. The other aspect you could consider is perhaps it just was not the printing culture tradition in England at the time to even consider these harmonious aspects of text and image like they would have done in Renaissance Italy. It was just simply not important. Woodcut initials were just part of the printing process and not a lot of attention was paid to it. Another viewpoint perhaps is also that from an expense saving standpoint, that these were lying around Barker's printing shop, that they were used in other volumes, and they were just reused perhaps for the King James Bible, which sort of speaks to the very unexpectedly haphazard printing process of the King James, because you would imagine a book of this importance would go through the presses in a rather smooth fashion. But this goes back, I think, to the original printing license. Christopher Barker gained the royal printing license under Queen Elizabeth, and his son Robert Barker, who inherited it, then printed this Bible. But it was enormously expensive, and he went into debt, so much so that he actually had to share the license with two of his competitors, Bonham Norton and John Bill, and it became very acrimonious who printed what, and a lot of lawsuits. And I think in the 1640s or so, Christopher Barker actually went to debtor's prison. So those woodcut initials can speak to the unusual, haphazard, acrimonious printing of the Bible itself. That is a typographical approach to the King James Bible, at least from my perspective. Another thing I could think about with the King James Bible is something I consider priority. Priority is an obsession of book collectors, book dealers, and bibliographies in terms of which text of an important book was printed first. Now, of course, if you're a bookseller, that's very important in terms of the value you might assign to a book, whether it's the first edition, first state of The Great Gatsby, or the first edition, second state of The Great Gatsby. But where did this obsession with bibliographical priority originate? Now, in the 18th century, there was some consideration to priority paid, I think, for incunabula. But I think that the King James Bible, was one of the earliest books that people obsessed over, earliest English books, I say, that people obsessed over priority. And sure enough, in 1890, William Smith, an English theologian, wrote a paper, an examination of the She Bible, where he, through forensic analysis, definitively concluded that the He Bible had priority. Now, the reason they called it the He Bible is because there were typographical changes and errors between different versions of the Bible. And in Ruth 3:15, I think it is, it has the word he, and that's later changed to she. But it's not the only typographical error. There's, I think, at least 100 typographical differences, including 3 lines being repeated at one point in Exodus, which again shows how hurriedly this was proofread and put through the papers. But this forensic analysis that Smith undertook was quite remarkable. He examined not only the typographical differences, but the spacing of different sections of the book, as well as the initial letters and their placement that I discussed before. And through all of that, he could conclusively determine that the He Bible had priority. And in my view, this was really the birth, so to speak, of our bibliographical obsession with priority. Another perspective, which I hope is not a too common perspective, is provenance. Now, generally in any book, booksellers are looking at the provenance, who owned the book, etc. But it has particular importance, for me at least, for the King James Bible and this copy. The reason I said that is for the most important book printed in the English language, we do not know to whom it was sold or how many copies exactly were printed. One of the reasons is the records regarding that were destroyed in a fire in Whitehall in, I think, about 1619. So there's no historical surviving evidence to speak of for that. But everybody calls it the authorized version, and it even says on the title page that it was appointed to be read in churches. Now, I don't think that would have been a marketing device, a marketing game of Christopher Barker, but probably a directive that was received from the Privy Council of the King, that it was really to be sold to churches. And sure enough, it is a pulpit-sized Bible, so you would imagine that this was not purchased for private devotion like the smaller Geneva versions. So any provenance, I think, that speaks to early owners in the King James Bible is very interesting, especially if it's private ownership like this copy contains. Now, this copy is filled with all sorts of little old 17th century doodles, and it is the obligation of every rare book dealer to take a magnifying glass and read every old doodle to see if they can discover something. And this was owned by the Earl of Kingsbury at different points, I think in the mid-17th century or so, which again I find very interesting because it's not just provenance, but it's provenance of the most important book in the English language and the distribution of that book, that this is evidence that not all of the copies were sold to churches and bishops, but actually this one, and I'm sure a lot of others, ended up in private homes as well. So that is thinking about the King James Bible from the perspective of provenance. And finally, I'll take an unusual take and think about the King James Bible from the perspective of book breaking. Now, book breaking, taking out individual leaves from a book and selling them, is a plague of the rare book business, I'm sure, for a century and a half at least. Especially in the 19th century, fine manuscripts were dismembered and sold individually for their beautiful illumination. I think that the King James Bible was one of the first English books really subject to this mutilation. You can see that even today if you go on eBay or any other sites, they sell all over individual leaves of the King James Bible at quite high prices. And I remember newspapers in the 90s that would appeal to evangelicals would often advertise them in the various papers like the New York Times for sale for Christmas gifts. It probably even goes back to the 1620s, actually, in the lawsuit between the Printers' Bill and Norton and Christopher Barker. Barker was accused of selling sections, unfinished sections of the Bible to booksellers. So a lot of individual leaves and sections actually were sold off, strangely enough, as early as the 1620s. There was a book collector, interestingly enough, in the 19th century, a great Bible collector named Francis Fry, who had the habit of taking out leaves and replacing them in other copies, which sort of fits that odd tradition of supplying leaves and book breaking. And I did just want to read a description of Francis Fry because I find it quite fascinating, from written by John Carter, the great bibliographical investigator, where he basically blames Fry for wholesale ministrations of the book. And he brings up some other famous bibliographically complex books, such as She Stoops to Conquer and Irving's Salmagundi and the Pickwick Papers. And he says, interestingly enough, any collector who wants a copy with all the points prescribed by bibliographers reconciles himself to accepting that it is made up, for probably hardly a single one was originally issued with every detail correct. So even when you have a first edition, first state, supposedly, of the King James Bible, a lot of that depended upon collectors like Francis Fry in the 19th century, who were mixing leaves from this book and that. So you can never be absolutely sure that you have the true first edition, first state. One other comment about the controversial Francis Fry that I like from a contemporary of his period says here that Fry's habit of tampering with Bibles, altering sheets, and inserting skillfully imitated title pages I strongly protest against. Mr. Fry's proceedings could be understood on the part of anyone who is a mere collector, but from a patient and laborious investigator like Mr. Fry, better things might have been expected. So I like, again, to think about the King James Bible not as a Bible itself, but one of the earliest English books actually regularly subjected to this horrible process of mutilation, which continues to the present day, not only for this volume, but for other important volumes as well. So I hope you enjoyed this little talk about thinking a book, even in a fine book like this, from a few different perspectives. I'm sure nothing I said is truly new or never been studied before, and I'm going to include some references below in the comments if you want to delve into it. But again, I hope to think about it in a way that it is not the most common way of thinking about the book, and I hope you'll use that technique for other books that you may come across. I certainly will, and thank you so much for watching.